Last not least, let's do the buttonholes. Now, the buttonholes can be put in vertically or horizontally, and it entirely depends on what button you've got. When you have a relatively small button like I do here, you can put the buttonholes in vertically and it's absolutely fine. But if you have a really big button like I do here, it's much nicer to put it in horizontally, because tell you what, to have this long buttonhole, it would start there. I mean, everything will be covered with buttonhole and it won't look very nice. The other thing is that when you're working with silk, the buttonhole will also look worse if you go that way. It's just silk, right? So I would recommend that if you have a really nice big feature button, that you put them in horizontally. So let's go and have a look how we exactly measure out where the buttons go, and we're going to put them in. In this chapter, we're going to concentrate on the buttonholes which go in vertically, and the bonus material will show you the buttonholes for the big buttons which can go in horizontally. Here we're just going to put in our small little buttons vertically. The buttons you can use are just the basic buttons that I've used, of course, here on the left, and then for the front as decorative I've used these little round buttons, but you can also use cover buttons, which I really like using. Unfortunately, my smaller size hadn't arrived like this and I had to use some really big ones, which I wasn't an absolute fan of. The button in my hand here at the top is a metal type, and then we've got this much lighter aluminium, I think it is, type that you get from Dritz these days, and I would suggest you get yourself that packet from Amazon. Like I said, the link is underneath this video, and then you only pay like a few pennies per button. In America here it's $5 something for a packet, and you only get 6 buttons, so I don't think that's you know, what we want at all. And I've got a little video for you there how to do that. The Sketchit is really brilliant, it does it very quickly, and you can make those buttons in just a few seconds. So make up your mind what you want to do. Buy the buttons or cover the buttons. You can use a small size button or a big size button. Everything is okay. Let's do this very slowly. Where does my button go? And actually there's a very simple rule to all of this, and we're going to look at this in some detail now. Vertical buttonholes will sit on the center of the placket. Now, the difference is when you want to put a really big button in, and you can go to the bonus material and check that out. But I see a lot of buttons hanging over the edge. It's because people trust the markings on pattern pieces for buttons, which is why I don't put any on. I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to fall for it. You need to work it out depending on the size of the button. The button will sit in the center here, but if it's a big button, it will sit further over. Okay, so let's have a look at how you work out exactly the perfect position for your button. And it's the same whether you use a big button or a small button. You want to have 0.5 millimeters from the top edge. That's where your button should start. Now just compare that to the big button. The big button would be too high, right? The big button would sit lower. That's why this 5 millimeter from the top edge is so important. Whatever button you use, move it down 5 mil or at least 3 mil, and then mark the center of that button, and wherever that goes to, that's the distance you want from the top. In this case, that's 1.5 centimeters. But when you have a smaller button, then of course it will be less, and that's why you can't trust just some buttonhole position markings on your pattern unless you're using exactly the prescribed size of button, which I think is a shame. You should be able to choose what you want. You can mark your button with a textile marker and just put a dot in, and I would do that. And now here, I'm just going to show you from the side, same again, 0.5 mil over, 0.5 mil from the top, perfect position. So now I'm going to mark the center of my buttonhole, and that's what I do. Now, actually, in real terms, usually they're all the same. It tends to be a centimeter over from the side and a centimeter down. A slightly bigger button will be 1.2, and then it goes up to 1.5 or even 1.6 or even 2 centimeters for a very large button. So you need to work that out. The other thing that will happen is if you have a really big button, and it happened to me on Victoria's dress, is that by needing to move over the buttonhole a lot, you're actually changing the position and you creating a larger overlap, which means that the button will sit either right on the edge or you've made the back smaller than it actually should be. Okay, so that's also something to think about. You want to use these massive buttons, and then you may want to add a centimeter to the part of the back that goes under, which is the right side. That would have to be longer than the top because you're effectively making it a little bit smaller when you are using a gigantic button. So I would recommend that you don't go over size 28 if you're doing cover buttons, or a 1.6 or 1.5 diameter for your button, because it will effectively make it a little bit smaller. But let's get on with how to put the perfect buttonholes in. Here I did exactly the same. I go that 0.5 mil. That's a centimeter in and up. And then I measure the distance between those two. I divide by one more. So 2 buttons go in the center. So I want to divide this distance by 3 because I'm getting 3 distances in between all the buttons, right? And put that in. 16.7 divided by 3 gives me, ta-da, 5.56. So 5.6 because we're rounding up. I would recommend that you do that with a pin first and then remeasure and then put your dot. I mean, I've in the past just like tons of dots because I worked it out in my head and I'm not too good at that. So I tend to do it first with a pin and then put a dot in after, once I've checked myself. There you go. Now, we want to put the buttons into the yoke. Now you can measure down the 5.6 and 5.6 again. And the interesting thing is when you now put the buttons on, and that's what I said in the introduction, they don't look like they are the right distance. They in fact look a wee bit less, and that's because you've got that seam. So optically it shrinks it a tiny bit. So what you do is you move that button down a tiny bit, not much, up to 0.5 millimeters, no more than that, to make it look right. In fact, I went down a little bit too much here for the camera, but you can see what I mean. It's important that it's optically right and it doesn't have to be measurably right. So in that case, I went a little bit lower for mine. I mark again that 1 centimeter distance on the point that I decided my buttonhole will start, and that's also where my button will sit. That being said, if you put in vertical buttonholes, of course you can vary where the button sits as well, because only the very top button of the dress needs to sit in the top edge. You could like go a little bit lower if you liked. The bottom one I won't put in. I'll actually just put a button on there. So fake buttonhole, we don't need it there, and it's too hard to get into that gap. And now we can put our buttonholes in. And for that, for some manual machines, you have to measure your buttonhole and then you have to like do it to that length. Or you have an electronic machine, and usually we have the buttonhole feet, and you just pop your button into the end there and that will do it perfectly for you. Then you choose the standard buttonhole stitch. Make sure that your tension is slightly reduced so you have a nice zigzag. On my machine, actually, I keep it on 4. That makes a really nice buttonhole. And then you put the foot onto your machine. you pull the sensor down, which is very sensitive. It stops the buttonhole sometimes in a mid-floor, and I'm going to just point that out to you in a minute where to watch it. You want to do a sample buttonhole, especially if you don't have a puff machine, if you're working with Janome. When I used to teach sewing courses and in school, we had these feet, and they tended to make really, really long buttonholes, way longer than you needed them to be. So I would check it. Make sure that you only have a little bit more than your button size so that it goes through. You cut it open and check it. And if it goes through just perfectly fine, if it's like really big, then just take your button out and bring it in a little bit at the back so that it fits. So now I'm going to find my little dot, and I put my needle down exactly on the dot, and then you line up the fabric in that point with the edge of the buttonhole foot. Put your buttonhole in. Perfect. The sensor doesn't have a real problem here when there's no fabric on the left hand side. When we do the horizontal buttonholes, it's way worse. If you touch that sensor, you've had it. The buttonhole will either stop midway, or it will only do one side of it, and you'll go, I don't understand. And it's because it's so easy to touch the sensor. And I just lift over my buttonhole foot to the next buttonhole. I don't cut the threads off, take it on and off. I just keep going. So if in doubt, turn the machine on and off, put it back on your buttonhole stitch, and do the next buttonhole in areas where you have the fabric a little bit bulky. And last one. Always do the top one last. Once you're in the swing of it and you're making the perfect buttonholes, you don't want to start at the top buttonhole just in case it goes wrong. There we go. Now we're going to open up those buttonholes, and if you are using a seam ripper, then please put a pin across the top of the buttonhole so that if you slip, it can't cut into your fabric. And too many people have done this. I mean, just go on your Facebook and check back how many people have put like posts on saying, oh no, seam ripper accident. And I would really not use them, but if you do, put that pin across it. What I do is I just simply use a nice sharp scissor, and here I'm just cutting in from both sides. And my technique is to fold over my buttonhole so it sits half and half, and then I do the tiniest of snip in the center, and then I open it out to either side, and I feel way safer with that, but everyone has their own way of doing it, so whatever you feel most comfortable with. And then to sew the buttons on, you want to overlap the placket, and because they're vertical, we don't want to go through the center of the buttonhole, we go through the top of the buttonhole so that the top edge can't sink down or push up too much. It did a little bit actually. You can see it on some of the photographs that I had blended in, that actually with the movement it moved up a bit, the edge on the one side, but I don't think it's very drastic. So the one thing to remember here is you want your button to sit like a little mushroom. So you want it to stand up a little bit so that when you do up your buttonhole, the button doesn't force the fabric down, you know, if you put it in tight. So I always have my thumb underneath there so I get that really important gap in which the other layer will sit, you know, when you do the button up. And then I do a loop. Have a look at that again. Turn that sideways. Can you see? There should be something standing here really nicely. Now when I do up my button, then it almost like floats on the top, and that's how you put on the perfect button. So I do the rest, all of them, put them all on so they look really pretty. Last one is of course a fake button. Just holds it together, And that looks wonderful. That's a really nice summer dress. Could I have put the buttonholes in horizontally? Yeah, I suppose so, but I think this is, for me, on this dress, I much preferred it. Now I'm just going to put on some buttons onto the front, and although they're only decorative, I'm still measuring it out. So I make sure that they are at least 0.5 from the top edge. I think they're even a little bit more here, I can't remember. And then I put the one closest to the waist at the same distance, measured the distance, divided it by the buttons plus one that I had, and then I marked that. Here I've already got that little stump for my mushroom. So I don't need to do that at all. I don't need to leave a gap. So that one I'm putting on tight. And I don't need to put that on with a ton of stitches either, because it is only decorative. And when I sew it up, I do that on the fabric underside just to make sure nobody sees it. I love these little buttons. They were nice because they were the same color as the buttons on the back. They're both from Joann's. And there we go, Isabella is finished. And if you have sewn along with me already, give yourself a pat on the back. And if you're about to start, well, then I would like to see what dress you've made when you're done. So share away on Instagram and on Facebook. Don't forget to hashtag us with Frocks and Frolics so that other people know where they can get this lovely pattern, because word of mouth is really how I can build my little business. And I thank you for being part of this again. And if you're just going to start, well, good luck with the dress. You can do it, and just take your time. And if you have any questions, you know that in the Facebook group you can just ask. Don't be shy. I'm there to help. And I'll see you again soon for another project.